Hey gang, we are back again for hopefully what will be, one of our last few coronavirus, COVID-19 shutdown Sunday schools, because our church is going to be opening back up. We are going to open back up with, some new rules, social distancing, all that kind of stuff on Father's Day weekend. So the June 20th and 21st. We're not going to have Sunday school right away, but I'm hoping really quick after we're going to be able to meet in person and have Sunday school in person again. So hopefully you guys, we won't have to do this all that much longer, because as great as these videos have been, and as much as I like hearing myself talk, I would way rather be in the room with you guys and hanging out and having fun. So that is going to be coming back. Be praying for that. Be looking forward to that. I know that I am. Well, man, this week is, if things weren't wild enough already, this last week and a half, or I guess 2 weeks now when you're watching it, has just been infinitely crazier, right? I mean, we had this video that went viral a couple weeks ago of a man getting killed at the hands of police officers, and then we have had just uproar and protests and riots and just across our nation. And man, if you're sitting back and just thinking, what is going on? I don't even know. Well, this week, in our series stories, we want to go to one of the stories that we find in the Bible that Jesus gave that I think gives us some really pertinent information that helps us kind of think through some of these things. As we're kind of talking about race and we're talking about inequality and the different things that are going on in this country, we're talking about racism, how should we as Christians think about this? What are some of the thoughts we should have? And so, one of the things I want to just point out in the beginning is that one of the reasons the Bible speaks to this is because racism is not a new thing. You might think that racism is an American thing, or that somehow we invented racism or something, but it's not. In fact, racism goes all the way back to the very beginning. I mean, ever since there was the family of Adam and Eve got very much bigger than it was, there was people who didn't like people and didn't like groups and didn't like other families and didn't like other tribes and didn't like other peoples. And racism is something, a sin that you can find in every culture always. In America, a lot of times we just talk about racism between black and white people and what does that work? But even in America, we have so many different ethnic groups and people groups here that this is just a big topic. And I just want to say a couple things. This isn't in my notes, but before we get into it, that one of the reasons that racism is a sin is because race is not actually a real thing. People's skin tone, the melanin in their skin, doesn't actually make any kind of difference in people and how they think. Your melanin can't think, your melanin can't make choices, your melanin can't decide between one thing and another. It's actually a pretty insignificant part of your physiology and your biology. And so everybody's a person of color, right? So you have people that are really dark skinned, have a lot of melanin. You have people that are really pale skinned and they have very little melanin, but everybody has some melanin. And so it's sort of I think a weak distinction to make. And really the Bible says that all of us were made from one man. All of us have our great grandparents all the way back to the beginning. We all come from the same two people, Adam and Eve. So we all share that same history, that same family, that same origin. And that means that all of us are made in the image of God, that when God made Adam in his image, and he made Eve in his image, that they, as they create people, that the reason people have value is because they're made in the image of God. And so across racial spectrums and across all those things, we're all from the same person. So that's why I think that racism is something that as Christians we want to decry, we want to be staunchly against. But it's also a fact of life that as long as there's going to be sin, there's going to be people who are going to divide over different things. And one of the things that people divide over is race in a sinful way. Well, that was true at the time of Jesus. In fact, Jesus told a parable kind of directly dealing with this. And so I want to kind of get into it. In the 10th chapter of Luke, Jesus tells us a story that I think has a lot of bearing, and I think that most of you are familiar with. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. In fact, we have Good Samaritan laws in America. All of that the origin of that word comes from this one story that Jesus told. This parable that Jesus told is all about the Good Samaritan. And there's some things that you might not pick up on right away if you hadn't studied this, or if you were unfamiliar with what the culture was like in the first century, Jewish culture was like in the first century, Samaritan culture, you might not pick up on it. So it starts in verse 27, and Jesus says, well, answer the question, what must you do to inherit eternal life? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Interestingly, in Luke 10, the lawyer, he's a scribe or a lawyer, is repeating something that Jesus had said earlier. They asked Jesus what the greatest commandment. He said there's two of them. He said the first is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, this is a contentious conversation. And so the lawyer comes back and says, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells this parable to answer the question of who is his neighbor. So he goes on to say, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. When he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side too. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring out on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii. He gave them to the innkeeper. Looking after him, he said, look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. The answer is obvious, right? The Samaritan was the one who helped this man. So I just want to kind of pull out some germane, important points here in this thing. The first is this: the conversation is all about what is the greatest commandment. You know, one of the things you're hearing a lot if you're paying attention on social media or on the news is you're hearing a lot of different solutions. A lot of people making different claims about what the problem is and what we need to do and how we need to fix it and all these things. And you're hearing a lot of anger and to be honest, you're hearing a lot of ideas that sometimes might sound good to us in the moment, but are actually terrible ideas. And how do we as Christians, how do we think through this stuff? Like, how do we get to actually seek justice, to actually find what's right? Well, it starts with obedience to God. We need to separate everything else, and we need to lay our lives on this foundation of what God's word says. And God says the first and greatest, most important commandment is to love God with everything that you are. To love him with your whole heart, with your whole mind, with your whole soul, with all of your strength. That we need to be totally submitted to God. And it says, then the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, it goes on, the other place in Matthew we're going to look at, it says that all of the law is contained in these 2 commandments. So these are commandments that Jesus gives us, and everything comes out of there. So if you are saying, God, I love you more than I love being an American. God, I love you more than I love being a van meter. God, I love you more than I love being, whatever. More than I love being white, more than I love being a Chargers fan, more than I love being whatever it is that you find your identity. And that the core of our identity is in being a son or a daughter of God and loving him with everything we are. And then as an outworking of that, we love the people around us. When you deal with a complicated issue like race or racism, you'll hear a lot of people saying, we need to listen to black people, elevate black leaders. We need to hold police officers accountable. Look, all of those things have their place. I'm not saying that those things are necessarily wrong or that whatever, but I want to say nothing changes hearts except for the gospel. It's the love of God in us, and then that working out of us that is what really transforms people. When I said earlier, it says in Matthew 22, he says, the first and great commandment is love the Lord your God with all heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is like it. And that word is like it in the Greek is actually, it doesn't mean similar, it means the same as. So in fact, loving other people is a direct relationship to loving God. It is what absolutely flows out of loving God. So the first thing is, man, we need to base our thinking, our lives, our approach to everything on loving the Lord your God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And so that means that as we think about race and racism, there's a lot of people talking about what should we do, and they're marching and they're saying those things. Man, the first thing we need to do is root ourselves in loving God and obeying his commandments, and then work out from there. The second is this question of who is my neighbor, right? In fact, Jesus is telling this entire parable to answer that one question of when the teacher of the law says, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus, he picks there's 5 characters here, And he picks three of them very carefully. The other two are less significant, but he picks these three characters very important. He says there's a man, we don't know anything about him other than he was going on a journey and he fell among robbers. They beat this man so badly that he was going to die if he didn't get medical attention. They beat him, they stripped him of all his clothes. So imagine the scene as you're walking along a dusty road, there's not a lot of people around, you're by yourself, and you come along a man laying there naked, bloody, beaten, and you have no idea what just happened, right? And he picks three guys to walk by. The first person he picks is the priest, and the priest would have been the most important of these three people. He would have been the one that people look up to the most, the strongest leader. He was it was just a really highly regarded position in the Jewish culture. He was well educated. He was a very religious, very devout man. He would have followed the Jewish law, literature, and tradition very exactly. And this is somebody that everybody would think, man, this is the pinnacle of who we want to try to be like. But Jesus says this man looks at the man, crosses the other side of the road, and just keeps on going. There's some reasons that he might do that we're not going to get too far into. That like in Jewish culture, you're not allowed to touch dead people. You're not allowed to touch blood. If you do, it would have been a big hassle. He would have had to go get cleansed in the temple, all this kind of stuff. But he cared a lot more about that stuff than he cared about helping this man. And the second man that came by was a Levite. Now, a Levite was not necessarily as high as a priest, but he was very similar to a priest. He was also higher up in the social stratosphere of the Jewish culture of the time. And he had his position by birth. He was born into the tribe of Levi, and he would have been kind of responsible for the temple and all the things that go on in the temple. And so he was a very highly regarded man. Well, he made the same calculation that the priest made. He saw that man and he crossed over. He said, that's too much trouble. I don't want to get into it. So he crosses over. The third is the starkest and most interesting character that Jesus picked, and he picked him on purpose, right? Jesus never did anything on accident. So he's picking this character very, very, very carefully. This character is a Samaritan, okay? Now, here's where you got to be a little bit of a student of first century Judaism or Jewish culture to understand what this character would have represented. But at the time, Jewish people, the citizens of the nation of Israel, and the Samaritans were totally enemies. This is where you're talking about racism is not a new thing. These guys had racial enmity towards each other in their hearts. They hated each other. The Samaritans, without knowing anything about them, they hated the Jews, and the Jews, without knowing anything about the Samaritans, hated them. They didn't have to, it's not like somebody stole their cow or there was a reason why. They just grew up. Everybody they knew hated them. There's a real historical background to it, but they both looked down on each other just totally. They just both thought the other one was the worst. And Jesus picks this man to be the hero of the story. He picks the Samaritan to be the one who's going to come out and be the example of what godliness looks like, what faithfulness looks like. We have to act with love towards those who we're at odds with. In this world, you're going to find a lot of people that you're going to be in disagreement with. They're going to look down on you. As being Christians, we're looked down on by a lot of people. You're going to encounter that in life. People are going to make fun of you. They're going to tease you. How do you respond in that moment? What is your heart towards them? Do you despise them too? Do you repay evil with evil? Do you hate them back? Or do you do what Jesus says and love them? Do you serve them? Do you prefer them? Do you go out of your way to help them? Because Jesus says if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, your neighbor, the question of who is my neighbor includes people that live next door to you that you might like and be friends with. It also includes people you're going to encounter that, man, they're not very lovely people. And they don't like you and they don't think you're very lovely. But how do you love those people anyways? And that's the question of who is my neighbor. So he picks this man to be the hero. And then what does he do? So I want to just think about what is the requirements of loving your neighbor. There's not a lot of room to pick and choose here. And a lot of times we think, love is like an easy word to say, but a hard thing to do. And I think that's true here. You think about what this man actually had to do. Is it required some personal risk, right? Traveling at this time was very dangerous. We can tell that because this man had fallen among robbers and they'd beat him and left him half to dead, stole his clothes and left him right there on the side of the road. This was a dangerous road that these three characters are walking on, the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan. They wanted to hurry up and get past the road. They didn't want to stick around because the longer you stick around, the more likely you're going to meet a bad person. okay, or a few bad people. And so they're all hurrying along. So when he came upon this man, he looked at him and he thought, the same thing you might think. What if this is a trap? What if this guy is a bad person and he had this coming to him? What if he had tried to attack some people and they beat him up and left him? He didn't know the situation when he walked up on it. He just saw somebody who was hurting and in need. The priest and the Levite kept going. The Samaritan stopped and said, look, I have to risk my personal safety to help this man, because this man is in help. This man needs help. And if I don't do it, nobody's going to. So the second thing is that, it required some personal commitment, right? This wasn't as easy as saying, hey, buddy, you okay? This man was unconscious. He had to get down and help this man. He had to bandage up his wounds and pour oil on him and give him medical treatment. He put him onto his donkey. So he was apparently riding a donkey. Put him on his donkey and took him to the nearest town where he went to the inn. He spent the entire night there taking care of him. The only reason this man would have been traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, was it Jericho? Did I say? Let's see. Go back to my very first page. My memory is. He was on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. I was right. I didn't need to go back. He's on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he would have been doing that because he was on business. He had somewhere to go. He's not just out for a leisurely walk. He was on a mission. He had to do something. He had business to take care of that was important, that required him to go down on this dangerous road. So the fact that he takes this man to the inn, he spends the night with him, he takes care of him all night, the guy groaning, trying to nurse this guy back into health and consciousness and give him water and food. Then he knows his job's not done because the man is not better, but he still has to go. And so he takes 2 denarii, he gives it to the innkeeper and says, take care of this man and I will return. I'm going to come back in a couple days and I'm going to help this man again. Think about the love and commitment this man is showing to this guy. Think about what Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. He's thinking, man, if I was in this man's situation, I would be desperate. I need somebody to help me. That's what I'm going to do to this guy. If you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, it's going to cost you something. It's going to require you to help and to actually pay out of your own pocket. It's going to require time. It's going to require effort. It's going to require thought. It's going to require diligence. It's going to require care. That's what loving your neighbor requires. So we look at this whole situation. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not a small thing to do. But if we're going to obey God's commandments, it's something that we must do. We have to be willing to see others and to love them. As I just want to encourage you guys, as you're this conversation is not going away. These things are going to happen again. That's how sin works. We're going to see it again. And as you're thinking about these things, I think those are some of the things we need to think about is, how do I love those who are different than me? How do I love my neighbor as myself and see God at working and somehow glorify God through all this? God is he's not missing from this situation. He's at work. He's building his kingdom. And the question is, are you going to be part of it? Are you going to go along with him and help build his kingdom? Or are you going to kind of go off with the world and do whatever the world's doing? My prayer for you and for me is that we would be about God's business. We'd be about serving him. I want to encourage you guys to do that this week. God bless you.